or social. There we go. So if you do not wish to be recording, you can turn off your camera or your mic. But otherwise, we honestly would love for you to have your cameras on. We want this to be just kind of a conversation between all of us. So even though this event is virtual, we'd still like to acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of who have been forced to leave for other places. So please feel free to share where you're tuning in from and the names of the people who have inhabited the lands before you in the chat. So as I mentioned before, I run the Student Ambassador Program along with Christina Nastos and Kathleen Grievers, and I'll put all of our information in the chat for anyone that's interested in learning more about the program or about Fashion Revolution, or anyone who's interested in joining our Ambassador Program, which will be kicking off again in September. And lastly, I'll also drop the link to donate to Fashion Revolution in the chat. These donations basically help us run our programs and to continue to contribute to the education of citizens on the issues surrounding the fashion industry. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. We're really excited for today's conversation, and really the kind of ethos and mindset behind the speaker series we've been having this summer is that there's a lot of people in the fashion industry that like want to make sustainable choices and want to make change, but don't necessarily know where to start. So really the goal is just to have an open conversation around circularity and also starting, a career in a sustainable fashion kind of space. That being said, I'm super excited to kick it off with our moderator, Ava, who will be introducing our speaker today, Simone.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ava, and I'm a rising junior at Northeastern University, and I am studying environmental studies and experience design. And I am so excited to be talking with Samar Younes today about her journey in the fashion industry and the intersection between creativity and sustainability. Samar is a creative director and branding strategist based in New York City. She was raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and attended Central St. Martin's School of Arts and Design in London for design and performance, exploring theater, film, video, and live art. She has worked with high-profile brands such as Opening Ceremony, Colette, Barney's, Lane Crawford, The Webster, Coach, Anthropologie, Laura Piana, Saks Fifth Avenue, Coachella, and more. She worked as Coach's Global Design Director of Brand Visual Experience for 6 years. Currently, Samar is the creative director at SHOWFIELDS in New York. SHOWFIELDS was conceived to turn the light, unveiling a world full of magic and wonder. Coined the most interesting store in the world, SHOWFIELD's mission is to give you an opportunity to see and be seen, to discover and be discovered, to inspire and be inspired. With a combination of experiences, art, and brands across style and beauty, home and travel, wellness and gifting, SHOWFIELDS is redefining the future of retail, catering to a savvy and conscious customer as passionate about art, culture, and mission, such as female-founded, Black-owned, cruelty-free, locally made, vegan, and POC-founded. Through orchestrating an interdisciplinary, sustainable, and art-focused visual brand strategy, store design, and experiences, Samar creates meaningful connections based on neuroaesthetics between art, brand, retail, design, and hospitality to bring innovation, inclusivity, and people together with the hopes to build the brands and experiences of the future. Thank you so much for joining us today, Samar, and I look forward to learning and talking more about your experience and your journey in the fashion industry.
Thank you, Eva, for the great intro, and Christina for inviting me, and Kelly. Thank you, guys. I'm really excited to talk to all of you and with the panel. It's one of my passion, sustainability and circularity, specifically in the industry and what I do in particular. So I think it's going to be a great panel.
I agree. And just to kind of dive in and kick us off, your field of expertise is really interesting and unique. And if you could just tell us a little bit more about what you do and why.
Yeah, of course. So basically what I do is cultivate and reinforce the brand story through the visual experience and the design identity of a brand, which is like overseeing a coherent brand narrative that corresponds to like a cohesive design vocabulary. So if you think of a brand, it's usually made out of design codes, visual kind of cues that make up what that brand is, but it's also different narratives and things that it's passionate about and it wants to reinforce. And those all feed into its visual identity, in which who it collaborates with, how it fabricates, how it reacts, how it sort of like curates things. So all of which are part of developing a strong visual identity and a narrative for that brand, which kind of goes into what the experience ends up being for the customer journey as they walk in or and experience that brand visually, whether it's online or in a brick and mortar space.
Wow, and what drew you to that field in particular, and especially in that way? I think that was something before learning a little bit more about who you are. I hadn't really thought about exactly what you're doing, so I would just love to know.
Yeah, of course. It's a very interesting question because I would never have thought I would end up in retail to a certain extent. I've always been passionate about fashion, but also about beauty, about culture, about politics, about social kind of causes. My biggest kind of goal forever since I was really little has always been about art and how art can really change the narrative, specifically when there is social turmoil in the world, how it sort of bridges the gap and communicate things in a very unique way. As artists has always been at the forefront of being able to channel stories in constructive way and connect people together. And I always thought, how can I bring art to the masses outside of a museum setting? How can I democratize art? And I just stumbled upon my kind of career in retail when I started with anthropology. And, because I couldn't really find something that specifically enabled me to do that. And I'm talking about, that was a long time ago. I'm not going to reveal my age, but it was several years ago, where art installation and public art weren't as sort of like big as they are now. And I wanted something a bit more meaningful. So I thought, why not, art to the masses could be through window display, could be through store experiences. So maybe there is one thing there in which was really interesting to explore. And with anthropology, I was excited because the use of material in which everything that was done was repurposed and sort of sourced in very ethical ways. So it was sort of like a win-win as far as like a start in a career, and then one thing led to another, and that's how I started.
Wow, I think that's such an interesting way. And also, I really loved what you said about like talking about democratizing art and kind of bringing art to the masses. And I think that's something that's really important. So I really love that. And kind of going off about what you were talking about, sourcing ethically, what do you think that the intersection and importance of creating and sustainability is to you? And how do you balance that in the work that you do?
Yeah. So I do think, oftentimes when people think sustainability, they often think of environment or, of course, unless you are more versed in the industry, but they fail to sort of acknowledge the social and economical impact of what sustainability means and how it affects certain communities, certain classes, certain, disadvantaged based on disabilities, gender, etc., in different ways. So what I think in particular in the industry, because we are an industry where we are catering to a consumer or an adopter, I prefer to call, and that's why one of the virtues I love about Showfield is the product in which you're thinking about what you're representing as far as product are things that you want to adopt and live with longer term versus consume, because the word consumption is always equates like fast fashion, like you're taking and you're throwing away. So it's just thinking of a mindset of starting to adopt, what you're actually experiencing or what you're looking or what you're buying is like a critical sort of mindset to kind of shift into, in which I think by showcasing the actual product in a more interesting way and making it a bit more artful and a bit more important, that immediately changes the narrative and how you're viewing the actual object, or how you're viewing the merchandise, which is one way in terms of how you're representing it. Also, it sort of affects, at that specific intersection, you stop and think about, what that specific thing that you're trying to buy, how is it going to serve you, and who is it affecting? Who are you buying from? Are you buying from a mission driven brand? Are you buying from a small founded businesses? So all these things are important consideration when thinking of sustainability in general. That's why that social economical layer is important to understand. Thinking of the packaging in which this brand is in, it is something that you are actually consuming, as in a beauty product or a food product, what is the landfill kind of repercussion of this. But this is in particular when creating or thinking of product in general. But when it comes to environment in particular, like visual merchandising and store design, our industry in particular is very wasteful, or has been, at least historically, very wasteful, in particular in luxury, because you have a lot of branding, and there is also with branding, because it really connects to the brand identity, a lot of things end up in landfill, so people can take them and sort of repurpose them in unethical ways for that brand, that hurts the brand identity. So I think there have been some progress there, but I think in particular that specific industry, there is a lot of opportunities that we are adopting in different ways that I can sort of elaborate on later, that are so important in the visual merchandising industry, because you can produce a lot of solid waste differently than fashion waste, but it is nonetheless waste.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that we often don't talk about as much. And I would be really interested to know a little bit more about, what ways that Showfields and also just any of the other brands that you've worked with, how that has evolved and how the trends and the changing ideas for our environment, both socially, ethically, everything has evolved since you've started working in the industry.
Yeah, of course. There have been a lot of shift. I think what's interesting is that I started with anthropology, which has always been about using humble material in extraordinary ways. And the humble material just happened to be things that you might buy in mass and repurpose. But I think that mindset shifted in terms of what is wasted material that you can repurpose, such as, creating an entire installation or entire window campaign around wasted bottles, or creating an entire window and sort of installation campaigns in the store about wasted felt from a factory. So these are the type of stuff about looking at materiality in a very different way than you would if you are in a luxury kind of industry. In the luxury industry, oftentimes materiality is key, because you want to replicate finishes that create a more elevated kind of brand feel. So you want to think of, like, a lot of finishes typically don't equate sustainability, like finishes such as chroming, finishes such as really like leather and felt, and all these different things that are like not felt per se, but like wool felt, or things that are a bit more, or wooden and mahogany, like marble, all these that are usually part of the luxury narrative. I think the shift there is being a bit more innovative in material in general, specifically in the design world. It just so happened that designers that are just as much as artists at the forefront of the world, and being at the pulse of responding to this need to really rethink about material in general, rethink about reinventing sort of like waste material in beautiful ways, where you can create beautiful terrazzo out of a recycled plastic, and you can create like an amazing like chrome finish out of like a really sustainable method in terms of how you mold and do. So I think a lot of fabricator now that supply the luxury industry are adopting these things. They're actually giving us options that are more sustainable, but also brands are much more conscious in how they're creating, as far as like modules that's to do with like rollouts. When you have like 400, 500 stores that you're creating a campaign for, instead of thinking of those elements as having an end life, it's thinking of those elements as being modular enough and how they can be reinvented after. So if you think of them as modular component, almost like a Lego, meaning the components can be reconfigured to create something different. And that's how you're thinking. It's the design thinking that's pushing you to be sustainable, which is a different approach. I guess it's similar to how you think about fashion and garment construction, in which, when you're thinking about what can be repurposed, what could be recycled, and a lot of the fashion brand and the industries in which they're creating a garment, what can be kind of repurposed, like this denim brand, which I forgot, where, the button can be kind of plucked out and you can take out the zipper, and then, the entire denim can go into the soil and be kind of like back to nature. It's similar when it comes to sort of designing environments, like thinking of modularity. What could be repurposable? What are the components or the part of this entire kind of big picture kind of sculpture or narrative of a sort of display, that portions of it can be repurposed for something else and portions of it could be recycled or reused.
Yeah, and I think that my next kind of question about understanding is, I know that you mentioned that you didn't really see yourself going into retail or fashion. So how did going into retail and fashion really shape your creative direction, and would you say that you feel like you've shaped, Coaches or Showfield's creative direction?
Um, I mean, I didn't say fashion because I've always been passionate about fashion.
Okay,
It's one of the reasons.
I misunderstood.
But retail in particular, like the stores in particular, I didn't think like it was a sort of natural transition, but it is, if you think about it, the most democratic way that you can connect with a customer, because it is a place that's available for all. It doesn't discriminate. Museums in the US in particular, they're not available to everyone. They are more so now, but in general, the culture of going to museum or experiencing art or having that at your disposal is not that common. Working in particular in the fashion industry or in retail in particular allowed me to really push the art narrative into every basically company that I've worked with, whether it was with Anthropologie, whether it was with any of the luxury retailers that I've kind of consulted for or sort of worked for, or with Coach in particular, because when I did join Coach, it was during a very specific transformative time of that brand by transforming a 75-year-old brand into an American luxury brand. So thinking of what can equate luxury, American, and quintessentially art, and its creator and artists that really make up a lot of that story, and how can that be pushed in the visual expression of that brand. And I think if you think of what shaped me in the retail industry in particular is being much more closer to the product and seeing like how much waste could be created and how I can utilize it. So I would save remnant of any leather that we would have with Coach to try to sort of redo something else with it, or I would sort of rethink like how can we sort of donate the end product. We would do auction at the end of like window display. If we couldn't recycle it in any way, whether it was with Anthropologie or with Coach, can it be donated into a children's hospital? Can it be sort of given to a school in which they don't have the means to create an aesthetically pleasing environment that we know psychologically affects and impacts so much the morale and the sort of like output of people. So it's that type of thought process of circularity that's not only micro within your design process, but also micro, thinking circularity as far as like how can it be donated, what's the end life, how can it serve a good cause.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think that what you were saying about on the macro level, I think that's definitely been something that has been more talked about and implemented, but especially, I don't know about when you were working at Coach, but it seems like it was something that like you were introducing into the brand. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So when I joined in particular, there was a change in the creative director of the product simultaneously that was happening during that same time. We were changing our entire store environment, how they looked, the materiality that was used, staying away from like plastic finishes and such. We're developing a new brand, codes in general that really resonate with a brand, but it's mostly pushing the artistry, pushing the narrative of, which is the same mindset of sustainability, is expanding the network of who we're working with. Instead of working with fabricators that only do mass production and certain fabrication, can we work with more artisans? Can we work with more craftsmen? Can we give opportunities and sort of like interesting kind of techniques and more artisanship into how we express our window displays and how we express our store environment or our fashion shows? All of it is interconnected. And one of the most incredible thing that I appreciate with Showfield is not only that we have art represented in a store through art installation and artists throughout the store, but I'm also able to grow the community of artists, craftsmen, and sort of artisans in general by the thousands, by creating an amazing network of all these amazing skills that we know they're kind of like not being safeguarded for many different reasons because of mass production and fast consumption, but also because of the fact that those brands or I mean those artists and artisans can't sustain unless they have a specific ecosystem that allows them to sort of like be represented, be able to be expressed, and be able to be represented. And I do feel like through what I do right now, it has been the most amount of um, platform that I'm able to give to the craftsman, artisan, and artist that I kind of push for with all the other companies I've worked for, of course, but with Showfield in particular, because art is such a big part of our narrative. And we create brand spaces for so many different brands. I'm able to bring this in like such a full circle in much bigger ways.
Yeah, I think now I'm going to just open it up to the floor. If anyone else has any other questions or anything that they'd like to ask Tamar, please feel free to either type it in the chat or turn on your mic.
I guess I have a question. This is a little bit more of a simpler question, but do you have any tips for people who are, just trying to get into creative direction or just starting out?
Yeah, of course. So my best tip for anybody starting out, specifically for creative direction, if there is an instinct with creative direction in general. Of course, it's a combination of knowledge, but there is also instincts that do kick in. And to me, it's actually how do you refine your taste level is by absorbing like a sponge early in your career every single interdisciplinary discipline you can kind of take on. I wouldn't limit, even if you are in one industry, I wouldn't limit myself because there's so much intersectionality between a variety of industry that really feed your brain and allow you to really evolve and express how you want to have your point of view kind of more elaborate. So for me, my biggest advice is to be able to dabble initially by learning around across many different disciplines, from design to fashion to like fine art to sculpture to installation art to food art to like there is all these industry are all interconnected and they create and form a point of view. But the more you learn about creators in general, whether they're in the music industry, whether they're in everything is so interconnected, you start to find line and you start to find parallels across so many different things. And once you kind of establish what you're drawn the most to and have this kind of like by acquiring a lot of that knowledge through internship at the beginning and sort of dabbling across all different industry, then you'll be able to focus and start to sort of like form your point of view or think about having a junior role in a specific industry that you feel stronger about. But whoever that industry is, let's say you go into fashion or let's say you go into design or into music, by having a much richer narrative that you started off with, that you sort of fed your soul with, in any shape or form, cultivated your soul in the biggest way possible, you'll have a much higher rate of success, being able to not only set yourself up for success and evolving within this specific industry, but be able to have different point of view, because we are in an era where cross-sectionality is so critical. Thinking in an interdisciplinary way is so critical, because we have so much at our disposal right now. I think oftentimes young people jump into just kind of like expressing themselves very quickly because of the tools that we have at our disposal right now, through social media, through the ease of a lot of different things. I think sometimes, really learning old school with different discipline, not only things that are at your disposal digitally, but also hands-on. It's so important, because touching, feeling, playing, it's such a big part of the process. There is a visceral quality that you completely miss when you don't kind of explore that. And you're able to really understand more of the creation process and the art direction process, understanding composition, understanding visual identities in a way that you're unable to do at all just if you just focus digitally.
Is this
Anyone
still
else?
open the floor?
There you are.
Hi.
Is this still like open conversation? Okay. Thank you so much for that. Just that conversation you just had, because I have always viewed it like that also. And I've been planning a trip abroad, and I want to go around to different companies and talk about, their practices and whatnot. And it's hard to explain to my parents, like, that I'm graduated, that I want to travel with purpose and, like, learn all these different cultures and people and hear their stories. So that experience, like, was very affirming with the direction I want to head. But I want to ask you from your perspective, like, when people go and have these experiences and conversations with people, how would you word it best to, explain these experiences when someone's hiring you, or like on your resume, or like on your website, like telling their story in a way? I don't know, like
So I
certain
think
questions to ask, when you are in that position. And because I'm still kind of new to this, and I just I still want to just learn.
Of course. I think what you're describing is being able to understand a bit more processes and craftsmanship that's happening in the different various company across different culture. Does that summarize it?
Yeah. Like, one of them, I'll be going to, like, Sweden and Denmark. So I'll be going to some sustainable companies there, and with some people at universities too that are in sustainable fashion. So it's just like kind of prepping myself to speak with them, and like important questions to ask, and just be mindful of.
Yep. I think the best way to sort of go about doing it and how you would kind of position this in your resume, I think what you're doing is critical. It's imperative to sort of absorb and understand different culture. It's another kind of part in terms of like how you're able to understand the world and creativity and fashion and sustainability in a very different light. So you're not only pigeonholing yourself within the point of view of one place, one city, one country. I think that is super important. I think what you're describing to me, the best way to go about it would be very kind of succinct and productive in the question that you want to ask, that allow you to actually create a really summarized, interesting sort of like almost like you can create a landing page out of it, or you can create potentially like a mini docu-series that you would actually produce from the outcome of your journey of doing so, that you can put as a palpable kind of thing on your resume. You can put it as docu-series from research from X, Y, and Z, accessible here, because otherwise, what people are interested most in when they're hiring you is understanding from the research that you've carried is what's your analytical point of view? How did you extract that information and present it in a way that is palpable and important for a company? Like, how did you extract that information? What are the key sort of pillars in which you feel would be kind of, whether they're process driven, whether they're, result oriented, what are the different things that actually could potentially serve this company that you want to work with? And by doing so and getting the research done, you're able to get a lot of that information. So if you're producing a docuseries and having it accessible, it's a great way to sort of have it on your resume and really like go such a long way in describing your point of view, your process, how you think, how you sort of put things together. It's like a perfect way to really summarize how you do and your talent.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate
Yeah, of
you
course.
taking the time to respond. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Definitely.
I think we have a question in the chat. So how hard or easy is it to get older brands to understand and involve in this manner?
I think history right now is on our side. Fortunately and unfortunately, what happened with COVID has been detrimental to all for so many different reasons, but it also has accelerated and forced so many things in the world, such as older brand, and kind of traditional thought process and traditional retail and traditional targeting of certain audience being very antiquated. So a lot of the older brand have taken a lot of things for granted by kind of sitting on their laurel and expecting that audience to come to them no matter what. The difference has been nowadays in a world where the consumer is much more savvy and has much more access to so many different things, so many different brands at their disposal, and is really more socially conscious, whether or not it's no longer expected that they're going to shop this brand because of the brand name or because it equates X, Y, and Z. So that brand has to make that much more effort to actually attract the younger generation that is much more socially conscious and much more aware of what's out there. People want to be unique. They want to have a unique expression and a unique point of view in what they dress and how they express themselves. So that comes, that is the same thing comes into a lot of older fashion brands. So what's happening, as you could see pretty much across the board with a lot of brands, is they're much more open to subversion. Some brand more so than others, but by creating collab with like younger, cooler brand is one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is by really kind of modernizing who they're shifting their audience to, and kind of like really juxtaposing different things within their brand image and their visual codes to really speak to a younger audience. You could see that happening with Tiffany with the brand new campaign. They hired Ruba, which is a very known creative director who worked for Revlon, who's very subversive in general, to kind of lead their creative campaign. And what she does, she completely kind of flipped Tiffany's kind of perspective and who it's targeting to be much cooler and edgier to speak to a younger audience. You could see that happen too across the board with so many, like we did that with Coach, like case in point, Coach 6 years, well, 6 years when I joined. So that was like what, 2006 approximately. No, I have to do the math. Hold on one second. I think 2012 I joined Coach. So basically when I did join Coach, it was a heritage brand, but the customer was a bit kind of not that cool, very Midwestern. Not that target customer is not cool, but they wanted to appeal to like a more like sort of like broader, more like dreamer, like younger audience that sort of really embodies what true luxury in America is. And obviously that portion of America wasn't represented or sort of inclusive in all its pillar and everything that it stood for. So like really thinking it was a holistic campaign across all different places, from visual codes to creating different product that's a little bit more engaging to younger brands, and to sort of also think to kind of change the perception. It takes time to change the perception of those brands. But I do think that the brands, I don't think it's that difficult. Those brands are much more open to change. So I don't think they're not that stubborn. Every brand that you're working with or talking about right now, from the luxury jewelry to luxury other kind of pillars or other kind of category of goods, are all open to subversion and changes. Are the luxury brand losing the moneyed population by targeting the younger, less financially established group? Surprisingly enough, actually, the bigger spender are the younger generation group, not the older generation group. And there is much more targeted spending. And I feel we should look at the world from a global perspective when talking about that in particular, because the US in general is no longer necessarily like the mega power when it comes to spending, specifically when it comes to the younger audience. So we have a much more affluent and stronger sort of like financial power with the younger audience in the Asian market, and particularly China. We have also in India too, where there is like a much faster growing population of spenders. Of course, the Middle East as well. So I do think it's that younger audience in particular, a lot of like entrepreneur, a lot of those young kind of like self-made entrepreneurs that you see nowadays are all very, very young, and these are the spenders. It's not as much the older population. So not that the older population is not spending, they are, but they're investing more in experiences versus goods. And same with the younger audience, but the younger audience is way more prone to spend on goods versus the older audience is way more prone on spending on experiences. Any other questions?
Hi, I had a question. So my background is graphic design, and I've been doing art direction more recently, and I've worked in a lot of for various fashion, corporate fashion world. I worked for Tumi for a couple of years. And I was wondering, like, in your role as creative director, like what kind of, and my apologies if you already talked about this, I was a few minutes late, but for like an influence over, production and manufacturing when it comes to sustainability and practices, like that, because you're obviously like dialed into what the customer is looking for, and you want to be like presenting the most, beyond just what like the metrics are telling you, just like what is coming up, which obviously sustainability is already here, but like as it's not going anywhere as what people are, searching for, but it still seems to be hard to have those, conversations to make a meaningful impact in, the products or the displays, things like that. So I was just curious, like what your experience was.
Yeah, I mean, I do think they are harder conversation, but brands are more open for it. For instance, I know Coach just launched like a program where people can bring their gently used bags that they're giving a new life, which is pretty innovative for a retailer in the sort of like luxury leather industry that is typically seen as pretty wasteful. And many brands also are following suit as far as like how to kind of give a new life to a luxury item, especially if those items are supposed to be investment. Like I have so many bags from my time at Coach that I don't want to throw out, but I'm also bored from like the same old. So if you're able to give it new life, and that's a great way to go about it. We are launching, with Showfield, a concierge service too, where artists give new life to different things in interesting ways, and that sort of like encourages circularity in general. So I do think generally speaking, brands are more open to doing certain things if it is something that they can palpably actually execute. I think where it becomes much more difficult is pushing an idea that's very hard, very costly, and very impossible to execute. For instance, I was really gung ho on pushing circularity and repurpose when it comes to visual merchandising, but I couldn't say I want you to repurpose everything that's out there because it was going to cost more in carbon footprint and repacking and putting it all somewhere and sending it to a storage, then kind of repacking it all and sending it back out. That was going to be less sustainable. So when thinking about repurpose, you have to think of the entire process chain, and is it really sustainable, and is it really less costly to actually allow the store to have a mechanism in place where it's super smartly designed and things can interchange without having to also add the carbon footprint of transport back and forth and taking it to a warehouse where it becomes more complicated. Same goes with environmental graphic. I know in general, in the world of graphic, that what we do is also thinking about the impact of vinyl in general and environmental graphic and such as something to sort of is it's easy, it's fast, and it gives an impact, especially when it comes to like windows and sort of like quick messaging and kind of marketing kind of initiative that you have to do. But like thinking holistically of system that could be set in place in which what you're updating or how you're sort of creating different environmental graphics, how can you do it in a way that is less kind of wasteful, where you have to print a whole graphic and sort of install it? Is there a way in which it could be a system where there is an easy digital display, and that digital display is not, it's very low kind of like energy kind of efficient, that could kind of serve that purpose? Or if it's not, if there's an analog way that's a little bit more exciting, that's still kind of inventive and cool to kind of translate the same idea. And if both of those fail, if there are a more interesting way to print on fabric, and it's like a sort of like repurposed kind of like muslin or canvas or other fabric that's easy to kind of repurpose, or carpeting versus like vinyl flooring, unless it's a recycled vinyl flooring. So all these things that are also part of the environment, there are so many different consideration, and they're a big part of the conversation. We have that all the time with Showfield, because we have brands that flip constantly all the time, and understanding like and building a library of tools and things that are interchangeable is so critical to the process, and thinking of branding in a way that is super efficient, in which how the branding can change with systems that are not wasteful. If you have a plan, like if you have a plan and present it in a palpable way to a company with like cost and what that means, then they're much more likely to sort of be open and kind of like into it than look at it as an impossible task.
Right. Yeah, something more modular that could be swapped in or out, or
Exactly. And there is also so much like in the graphic environmental sort of world that is very kind of sustainable too, with so many different innovation now that are available, and technologies from AR, VR, meta environment. There's so much out there that is really amazing. Like it's just a matter of understanding like certain things might be a higher one-time investment, but it will be so much more sustainable and give you so much bang for your buck down the line.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
It looks like Reagan has a question. So when you're marketing and sustainability to a broad market like Instagram, what methods seem to be most effective / moving towards consumers?
So obviously you guys see a lot of sustainability marketing out there, and some of it is very much blanketed statement, and it's just kind of like, you know, wording to kind of draw an audience or sort of just be sensationalized. I think the best way to market towards sustainability is being educational and giving tools. that's what people lack and that's what people need. So when you're thinking of a brand and what it's doing from a sustainable way, instead of only discussing, okay, we're doing this and this is great for sustainability, actually explaining the impact in which what this initiative is creating and how it's affecting the supply chain, how it affecting the social economical landscape, as well as the outcome for the customer, because the customer is much more likely to understand it in a much more impactful way and be able to actually buy that product in a way that they feel much more comfortable with, versus, oh, this is sustainable. Because oftentimes, there is very kind of vague ways that this is described, or it's more like it's done in sustainable method, but what does that mean, like, and what is that impact, and who is it affecting and who is it benefiting? I read, an interesting stat recently. I think it was in Vogue Business. I'm not sure if you guys read it, in which um, a lot of like reusable kind of like secondhand fashion brands are actually, there's a study in which found to be less sustainable than fast fashion. And apparently the reason why is because of all the dry cleaning, the trucking, the back and forth and such, apparently is more wasteful in general, or more impactful on the environment than actually fast fashion. So what I'm saying is, because now it's like such an era in which we're trying to kind of test out so many different things and trying to think so much about like how to sort of like reuse and repurpose and be clever. I think the easiest method is to consume less, but consume purposely, of course. But like what to do with what we have right now, and what is this excess in production right now, and thinking about that specific part in ways that is much more socially conscious, and the fabrication of those processes in place.
That's amazing. That's also crazy about how dry cleaning is so horrible for the environment. But it's one of those things that like we never really think of, especially if you were to go to like say a Rent the Runway or something like that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. I think we have another question in the chat. So Rebecca just asked, what are some brands that are doing very well in honest sustainable marketing?
Really good brand sustainable marketing, I can't really think of any specifically. I know of, some amazing sustainable kind of fashion forward site that I feel really great about, specifically the one with Celine Simon and what she does in general. I feel is incredible, and a lot of the initiative that she has done with a lot of luxury brands, and helping them kind of create different narrative, from Rebecca Minkoff to Philip Lim, etc., that actually affected social economical changes that drove sustainability. And I feel what that created and what that did was kind of address so many different things, from um, inclusivity to indigenous sort of like impact, to actual specific supply chain, to what part of the world certain things are being kind of sourced from. So I think a lot of the initiatives that have been done by her and her company with the different fashion brands have been one of the most kind of honest marketed initiatives. Which I think, what is Celine's, what is it called again? Her,
Flow Factory.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
Slow
type
Factory.
it in chat.
Yeah, the Slow Factory. Like, and you could see a lot of the initiative. They've done something with Gucci recently that's great. But I think the more for me, the most honest one are the one that are affecting social economical changes, because that is the key in sustainability. One fashion brand, what they're doing in general is not even making a dent in the bucket of fashion sustainability and supply chain. It's more the longer term kind of like pillars, of and foundation in manufacturing, and being much more conscious in how they're doing things that are not going to kind of come about until much later. But I think the shorter term kind of impact is more socioeconomic with those specific brands. An initiative they're putting forward towards education, towards being able to create equal opportunity in which places in which there is like gender inequalities, in places where there's no access to water, and places where there is a lot of like really urgent matters that need to be resolved.
Yeah, and speaking of the Slow Factory, they actually just partner with Adidas as well, and they have a whole series on their website talking about all of the things that you're talking about, Samar, that are free and really easily accessible. So if you're looking for more, that's a really great place to look as well.
Yeah, it's a really great source. I mean, of course, a lot of these athleisure companies and both Adidas and Nike recently have been very innovative in materiality exploration, which they have the means to do, but they're still very much landfilled kind of product, or because they gear or encourage mass consumption in an insane way. So I do think it's beyond just the material, it's also the messaging of the encouragement of mass consumption versus adopting things that you love but you really cherish and want to live with. And by doing so, you're also supporting a good cause and a smaller brand that is not mass produced.
It looks like we have one more question in the chat. So Hannah asks, what are some characteristics and experiences you would look for in a creative team member?
Great question. So to me, it's important. I mean, my third language is English, right? And I am Lebanese. So the reason I mentioned this is because having a worldly perspective, no matter where I come from in the country I lived with, the people that I like to surround myself with and work with would equally have a wide variety of mindset and cultural sort of like kind of understanding, generally speaking. Because when I think of catering to a customer, I think of a global customer versus just a local customer. And I think of them across all their different cultural sort of like nuances, and if this is inclusive, if this is mindful, or is this gonna kind of like offend this person, or is that person feel represented in this graphic, or is this sort of like does this give any sort of like nod to colonialism, or does this give any sort of like, so all these nuances are so important, and they're hard to train. So it's important that the team member that joined the team either really is open and have an understanding around this and the same sensitivity to design with this mindset, or comes with that mindset already in place. So they're either open to understanding it or comes with it. This is more important to me as far as designing and having the right team members characteristic, because everything else is just like hard skills, like technical skills based on the role that's necessary, which are more hard skills versus soft skills.
Awesome. That makes a ton of sense. I know that we have a couple of questions. I believe Doris.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your wisdom. You mentioned something about new materials, and I'm seeing a lot of things out there that are being proposed as like a sustainable material, but it's a copy paste from a press release. And DuPont had the fibers Sonora that I thought was a little questionable. Now there is an initiative with Lululemon, and the whole press release is about them using sequestered carbon on the development of a fiber. But if you start reading in it, the carbon is used in the process of transforming ethanol into polyester, right? Okay, we normally make polyester from oil. Now we're making polyester from ethanol, which is essentially, it would come either from corn or from sugarcane. So you're taking something that could be a food crop, transforming into a plastic, transforming into polyester that, it's not going to go anywhere. And, those are just like two examples.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about, like the issues with cotton or the way people are still reluctant with certain materials that we know, but like we are just swallowing everything that press releases are saying about new materials. And I wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, of course. I'm all about innovation, but you have to take information with a grain of salt. I do think, one brand I didn't mention that does really honest marketing and is really innovative, but in a way that's productive with material is Stella Mccartney. Obviously, she's a diehard environmentalist, and with a lot of the crops in which how also she's cultivating and kind of creating the sort of supply chain and the loop is very transparent, and you could see exactly what is the entire process in terms of how it's created, where it's going, and how it's going to end. It's the entire circle. And I think oftentimes with the material that you're mentioning, for example, you don't have the full transparency of the entire circle. Like you have the transparency of what is the alternative way that is generated to create X material, but there is not a full transparency in how that loop is closed. And I think the most important part when reading such press releases, if you don't have enough information or you can't dig enough information to give you the full circle in terms of what is the end result of this material, then that material is not necessarily promising yet until you have the full transparency of where that's ending, and I think with those material in particular, it makes it much more challenging. I understand like the mushroom, like creating, I know the sole of one of the product was made out of mushroom. That's easy to understand, it's palpable. But when you're thinking about like things that are produced from ethanol or oil changes through the processing, that's way more kind of specific, and it is not something that's readily available. It also does affect social economical conditions, which is much more major in its sourcing and its sort of supply chain and production chain. So that requires more scrutiny to kind of really look into before even kind of considering it as a palpable material.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, of course.
I know that we're at time. We do have one more question, and then we could wrap things up, but I just want to make sure we get to it. Brooke asked, as a creative director, how do you approach consuming market trends /art /staying up to date and being that sponge you referred to earlier? And how do you take what you consume and determine what to implement in your projects?
Great question. And it kind of explained how my eyesight is declining like crazy. But I'm like literally, I follow so many accounts. Like I am like, basically, I'm in my mid 40s. I'll tell you my age, but basically I am very much into being very in touch across the board and in an entire interdisciplinary way across everything that's happening, across everybody that I think are tastemakers in general, and also people that are innovating in an interdisciplinary way across all culture. I'm very much into different kind of trends and looking at cultures globally of what's happening, what are people drawn in from a sort of a cross-culture perspective. So I'm interested what's happening in India, I'm interested in what's happening in China, I'm interested in happening what's Africa, what's resonating with the different audience, what is the most kind of important thing for that young generation, and what are we doing across all these different kind of parameters, how are we treating addressing different sort of cultural need, different religious needs. All these things are basically things that I look at all the time through simple, like as basic as Business of Fashion, Vogue Business, but also looking at places like WGSN, where, you know, even if you're not a member, you have access to sort of like top level reports as a non-member. I'm also kind of course, Culture Club. Is it Culture Club it's called? Or I kind of always butcher the name of it. So I'll tell you, not Culture Club. I'm in Clubhouse. I don't know why I call it Culture Club all the time. But Clubhouse, kind of like listening to a lot of the podcasts that's happening, in which always kind of informs me. But just by being in touch with the young generation across the world gives you so much insight of what the trends that are upcoming. So with Showfield in particular, we curate different themes every 6 months, and we decide ahead of time, way ahead of time, what is our curatorial approach going to be? What is the theme? So before, you know, everybody was talking about togetherness, we've already established togetherness was going to be a big theme coming up for this season. Before people started to talk about healing, we've already kind of established that healing was going to be a big trend, and how our different, and because we are very in touch with what the artists are doing, what the young generation of creators are doing, and what are the people actually responding to, what are their pains, what are their worries, and how are we creating like opportunities and environment where they feel inspired, and they feel where they can get out of it way more that they would have kind of bargained for in an environment that's not a museum, not a gallery, not a retail store. So I think it's so important to be on top of how people are feeling in order to evaluate and establish what your best trend to pursue. That is the biggest way to sort of kind of evaluate trend, more so than any inspiration, any Pinterest, any sort of travel, anything like that. Of course, travel is a big part of how you connect with people, but if that's not available, there's so much at your disposal. You have a mega community, and they're all a DM away. That's my motto. You can ask any question.
Well, thank you so much, Samar. And you just are so insightful, and we were all so appreciative. Everyone in the chat is saying thank you so much. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. It was great chatting with you guys. And if you need anything, Christina, you can pass on my handle, and I'm happy to sort of answer any further questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, shout out Ava. Thank you so much for putting together the questions and moderating.
Amazing moderation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I've put all the information for Fashion Revolution in the chat up there. So if you guys need anything, feel free to find us on LinkedIn or email us. And yeah, hopefully you guys have a really great Tuesday night.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Ready. Oh, I did take a picture, but thank you for